Hey guys, so types of assessment. There are various types of assessment, and then the most common ones that we can hear of is your formative and your summative assessment. So the previous discussion has discussed on the difference of these two. I just would want to recapitulate on it. So class, when I talk about formative assessment, here's an image that I captured from the web. It says class that formative assessment now is when the chef tastes the food or tastes the noodles. Plus, when you say summative assessment, it means that when the guest would taste the noodles already. So, in other words, students, in terms of education, this is one graph I retrieved from the web also. When I say class formative assessment, your formative assessment would help the students to learn and practice. The goal of your formative assessment is to help your student learn and practice. Whereas class your summative assessment would assess the performance of the students. Now, in your reference text, we usually say that formative assessment is done during, okay, class, your formative assessment is done during, or let's say before and during the discussions. Okay, so when we talk about formative assessment, it's done before and during the discussions. Okay, that's one way of differentiating them. And then another way, class, is by saying that summative assessment is done at the end of the instructional period. That's why I would usually say that summative assessment is likened to an evaluation, and its goal already is to assess the student performance. Now, why are we doing formative assessment? The purpose class of your formative assessment is to identify the gaps and improve learning. Okay? Now, one example class of your formative assessment is this. For example, I will ask you, let's picture ourselves that we're having a discussion in a science class. Okay, if we are in a science class, and then I will be asking you, what are the different types of, or let's say, for example, what are the different components of a food chain? For example, I will be asking you, what are the different components of the food chain? Or most of you here are on PE. What are the topics on PE? Okay, what are the different types of rhythmic activities? So example, we discussed rhythmic activities today. And then I'm trying to determine whether you understood the topic or not. So I will be asking you, okay, students, what are the different type of rhythmic activities? That in itself is formative assessment. If I notice that my students do not or cannot recall what are the rhythmic activities that I mentioned about 15 minutes ago, it would mean that I need to reinforce my discussion. It would mean that I need to reinforce my discussion. So class, anong ginawa ko? I identified the gaps in learning, and then I'm improving the learning process of my students. Okay? Now, how? It is via approaches that support specific student needs. So in your formative assessment class, you focus on specific students. No? You focus on specific students. So what do we mean by that? For example, class, you have noticed in the class, for example, in your English class, here comes your student, or let's say, Filipino. Marami din dito yung Filipino major. No? Let's say sa Filipino class mo, merong mga estudyante na hindi talaga marunong magsalita ng Filipino. Okay, or may mga estudyante tayo na parang napakatigas talaga ng dila when it comes to Filipino. So what would you do with these students? You try to engage them in class. Okay? Now, when you say engage them in class, if you would want to be specific to the needs of your students, huwag nyo silang gulatin at saka for example, tawagin mo yung attention at saka sabihin, okay Jamie, recite to me the entire poem in Filipino. Huwag magkaganon. Kasi si Jamie masyashock, first time niya, tapos hindi pa siya halimbawa marunong ng Tagalog. So what would you do? Maybe you would ask Jamie, Jamie, can you please read this paragraph? Or Jamie, can you please read this sentence? In the story, El Filibusterismo. Kung kaya kung nakikita ninyo, di ba, isa sa mga diskarte na ginagawa ng mga Filipino teachers is that when we are discussing, for example, Noli Me Tangere, ano pong ginagawa natin sa isang chapter, sa isang kabanata po ng Noli Me Tangere, we allow the students to read, no? We allow them to read. So, halimbawa, ikaw first three sentences, next paragraph naman yung isa, next paragraph naman yung isa. Pagkatapos, we are trying to determine if sino po yung may difficulty sa pagsasalita. That way, we are engaging the students verbally, and at the same time, we are eliciting them to understand that specific chapter on the work of Rizal. Okay? Now, when I talk about summative assessment, as mentioned here, it all is done to collect evidence of student knowledge. Now, the keyword there naman that you would have is evidence. In other words, class, it's already done. Kumbaga, learning process. Or no, let's say, for example, the lesson class is already done. And what we're trying to do is evaluate whether the student understood the lesson or not. Okay, we are evaluating the student knowledge, his skills, and then his proficiency. And how do we do that? Via your exit learning products or cumulative assessment. Ano yung exit learning products? At the end of the course, for example, di ba, secondary students, for example, at the end of the subject, you would have your post-test. Or at the end of the subject, you will have your final exam. That's an example of your summative assessment. You're trying to find out, did they really understand the entire program? Did they really understand the entire subject that we talk about? Okay? So that's your formative and summative assessment. Another way of differentiating this is that saying that formative assessment is assessment for learning, whereas class summative assessment is assessment of learning. So formative, for learning, assessment, a summative, assessment of learning. Okay? There are 3 types of assessment naman sa ganitong uri. Sinasabi niyang assessment for learning, and then that's your formative. Then your summative class is assessment of learning. Okay? Assessment of learning. The third type, which is assessment as learning, is actually geared already towards your authentic assessment. Assessment as learning class is already geared towards your authentic assessment. Okay? So those are the different types of assessment, formative, summative. Now let's tackle the next type, which is your diagnostic. Okay, class, pag diagnostic usually, diagnostic, siguro yung keyword na gagamitin natin para mas maalala siya natin is the term diagnosis. Now, it aims, class, to detect learning problems and difficulties of the learners. Di ba, class, pag sinabi nating diagnosis, usually medical siya, di ba? Kaya pag sinabi nating class diagnosis, usually medical siya. So, that would be able to identify or help us identify, for example, if your patient or if your student has dyslexia, or if your student, for example, has dysgraphia, or what do you call those students na hindi makafocus sa klase mo? Alam mo yung student na sinasabihan mong lahat, all of you please sit down, or all of you please focus, pero siya would be running around the classroom. What condition is that? Anong condition daw yon? Sige, I can see you talking. What condition is that? Sige na. Yung mga students mo na parang hindi makapagpahinga, what do you call that? Yes? Yes, Heinz.
Is it ADHD, sir?
Yes, no? You have your ADHD. So you have your conditions such as your attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So as the term implies, attention deficit, kulang po sila sa attention. Tapos hyperactivity, hyper po sila sa klase natin. And then there are a lot, no? There are a lot of learning problems and difficulties. So marami. So when you talk about diagnostic assessment, your diagnostic assessment class would be able to administer corrective measures or interventions done to ensure the learning process. So halimbawa, when I know that my student is a possible candidate for ADHD, if your school would allow it, there are, for example, examinations to screen for ADHD. Okay? If nakita ko, for example, na ang estudyante ko is parang may dysgraphia, in other words, class, kahit ano pang turo ko sa kanya ng graph, hindi niya talaga ma-understand kung ano yung graph, or she could not able to draw it, no? So the disorder class, which is distorted po, or what happens is that in a while, so dysgraphia, they have difficulties in writing straight, they have difficulties with holding and controlling a writing tool, and sometimes plus they write letters in reverse, no? So matagal mo na silang tinuturuan, alam mo grade 1 supposedly sumusulat na, pero hindi siya class makasulat ng straight. So you would suspect that your patient has dysgraphia. Okay? Another naman class na problem is dyslexia. Pag sinabi nating dyslexia class, maraming uri kaso ng dyslexia, no? So may surface dyslexia and the like. However, class, when you talk about dyslexia, it involves difficulty reading due to problem identifying speech sounds. So, ang problema po niya is nasa speech sounds. No? So, merong phonological dyslexia, kung may mga phonetics yung problema, rapid naming dyslexia, may double deficit din, may surface at saka visual dyslexia. Okay? Now, we are learning that there are different types of those because you are encountering these students in the academe. And then it is wise for us as educators to detect them early so that early interventions could be done. Okay? Meron class, alam nyo, mga grade 1 na na-notice ng ganon. Tapos hanggang grade 3 na lang, hindi pa rin makasulat. Tapos by the time that they will be referred to an expert, grade 6 na or high school na. So it's already too late on their part. Okay? So that's why we have your diagnostic testing. But take note, earlier I mentioned if allowed by your school to be done by the teacher. Bakit ko pong sinasabi na if allowed by the school? Kasi class, when we talk about diagnostic assessment, oftentimes this is administered by your psychometrician. Oftentimes, class, this is administered by your psychometrician. Or class, it could be also administered by your guidance counselor. Okay? So, hindi lang po lahat ng oras si teacher po yan. Pwede pong si psychometrician at saka si guidance counselor. And then when we talk about the diagnostic test used at school, please take note that they act only as screening. They act only as screening. So for example, may ginamit akong questionnaire para sa ADHD. Pag lumabas po na, for example, lumabas sa questionnaire, there is high likelihood of ADHD. It does not actually mean or it does not actually confirm right away na may ADHD talaga yung bata. It could be possible, class, na wala siyang ADHD pero high risk lang siya doon sa questionnaire mo. So sino po yung makakapag-diagnose na may ADHD yung bata? Kailangan po natin ng tulong ng physicians natin and kailangan po natin ng tulong ng iba po nating experts such as your psychometrician and then your guidance counselors. Okay? Now, later on, you will know among your patients with special needs, not all of them actually needs to be placed for the school for special children. Okay? Hindi naman po lahat kailangan ng special attention talaga na mag-one-on-one. It would depend on the condition of your patient. Now, plus when you say diagnostic test, di ba sabi natin kanina pag formative, okay? When is formative assessment done nga, guys? When is formative assessment done? Anybody? When do we do formative assessment? Anybody? Sige na, huwag
Before
mahiya.
and during, sir.
Okay, so class, yes, tama. On chat also, tama. Jamie, tama. So before and during. Pag sinabi ko namang summative, your summative is done at the end, di ba? Or after the lessons. Now, if I talk about diagnostic, guys, your diagnostic is done after seeing the signs of learning problems in the course of teaching. Okay? So, paano nyo gagawin yung test? Class, pag kayo po yung bibigay ng test, huwag nyo naman ibigay sa classroom. Halimbawa, for example, nagle-lesson ka, tapos gusto mo itong evaluate itong isang student kapag may learning problem. Huwag mong ibigay sa classroom mo, tapos nandyan yung mga kaklase yan, nakatingin sa kanya. You know why? Pupils would be thinking, oy, bakit may special exam siya? Bagsak ba siya kaya may special exam siya para maka-add? Or unfair naman, si ma'am binibigyan ng special exam si classmate. Okay? So do not let other students or do not do it publicly amidst all other students. It's best for you to call the attention of the child and then ask the child to remain after class or maybe to ask the child to come early before class for you to have the diagnostic exam. And where is the best place for do that? Maybe beside your table if you don't have any other private office. But if there is a private office like that of the guidance counselor, you allow the child to take the examinations with the guidance counselor. Okay? Now, it can also be done, class, at the beginning of the school year. It can be done at the beginning of the school year for the spirally designed curriculum. What do we mean first by spirally designed curriculum? Plus, pag sinabi kong spirally designed curriculum, for example, if we're talking about first year, second year, third year, and fourth year, in a spirally designed curriculum, class, what happens is that bakit siya spiral? Kasi po, the topics that I am using in first year, for example, nung first year pa lang, class, yung natututunan is x plus y, x minus y. Pagdating ng second year, class, natututunan ng x squared minus y squared, x squared plus y squared. Pagdating ng third year, may square root of x squared, y squared na. Pagdating ng 4th year, may trigonometry na. So ano pong ibig sabihin? The topics right here are dependent on what the student learned in the past. It's referred to as spirally designed curriculum. Bakit spiral? Kasi po, paulit-ulit yung topics. The topics class are repeated. However, class, it is increasing in complexity. The topics class are repeated. However, it's increasing in complexity. Okay? So most of our curriculum are actually spirally designed. So what does it say here? Class, your diagnostic test can be done actually at the beginning of the school year for this type of curriculum so that corrective actions can be applied if prerequisite knowledge have not yet been mastered. So halimbawa, papasok na siya ng grade 1. Pagkatapos class, may diagnostic test ako prior to grade 1. Class, no? Di ba, diagnostic test, pwede natin gawin yan. Halimbawa, yung klase natin dati, usually nagbubukas June or July. Okay? Pag yung eskwelahan nyo, gumagawa ng diagnostic test for grade 1, you can conduct that as early as March or April. Ano pong purpose ng diagnostic test? Pag nakita ko na, ay, itong mga kabataan parang hindi pa talaga ready. Itong mga kabataan hindi ready for math. They appear to have been poor. They have poor math skills. So anong gagawin natin? Pwede pa po tayong mag-remedial classes or pwede pa po tayong mag-additional classes in such a way that by the time that they will be entering school by June, they already know the prerequisite knowledge that they should have mastered. Okay? So kung kaya po may mga diagnostic exams na kinakonduct yung ibang schools natin. Now, next type is, the one earlier was referred to as your diagnostic. Now, the next type is your placement. When I talk about placement exam, your placement exam is best done in the beginning of the school year. What's the purpose of your placement exam? To determine what the learners already know and what are the needs that could inform the design of instruction. Okay? Maybe a good example of this is, I don't know if you're familiar with the special science class curriculum and the secondary, no? In the secondary or the high school. So ano pong ginagawa natin? For example, diba, sasabihin, let's have the placement exam for SSC. That helps us determine whether what design of instruction is appropriate for this student. Is this student akma or is this student bagay or appropriate for SSC, or shall this student be undergoing the regular classes? Okay? Parang ganon. So that we will know, kaya nga ba ng student na to na may mga research subject na siya? Kaya nga ba ng student na to na may mga advanced chemistry na siya, advanced trigonometry in the senior high school? Okay? Or junior high school for that matter. Then plus, groupings of learners based on the result is usually done to make it relevant to address and accommodate the entry performance of the learners. Now, basahin natin ulit. The grouping of the learners is important to make it relevant to address the needs to accommodate the entry performance of the learners. Now, what do we mean by that? No? Kahit sa school man usually, di ba nakikita ninyo that usually you have your section 1, di ba? May section A kayo. Kadalasan sabi nyo pa star section. Tama? Pagkatapos mayroong section B, section C, section D. Kadalasan yung ginagawa ng mga schools, yung section A, section B, and section C, these are the top students. Pagkatapos section D, section E, F, papunta man sa kung anong letters yan, usually nakamix na yan. Okay, nakamix na, hindi right away na. For example, kapag section A, mga 90 average dito. Si section D class to H, usually nakamix na yan, tag 75 or up to 89, mixed. Now, what's the purpose class of stratifying this? No? Itong isang fallacy na makikita natin sa educational systems natin. Kung ma-observe nyo dati-rate, or kung nakikita ninyo class sa education natin, sino po usually ang binibigyan ng quote-unquote magagaling na teachers? Is it the section or the top section? Or yung mga mababang section na mababa yung grades? Sino po usually ang nakaka-receive ng mga magagaling daw na teachers? Sige nga, anong na-observe nyo? Ang na-observe nyo lang, just for the purpose of discussion. Sige na, who receives those great teachers, awesome teachers, awardees daw, master's degree holder daw? Sino? Sino sa kanila? Diba? Usually, top sections, ano? Top sections. Diba? Okay? So class, it would appear as if that more focus is given to the special science class. It would appear, class, that more focus is given to the students who are intelligent. Di ba ganun yung nangyayari? No, na-notice nyo yan. Pero supposedly in education, kung titingnan ninyo, class, dapat everybody should receive equal treatment. Okay? Kung dapat pa nga, kung titingnan ninyo, dapat bigyan nyo pa nga ng focus kay itong lower sections because there is a learning deficit on their end. Okay, there is a learning deficit on their end. Whatever that learning deficit is, okay, may that be, I'm so sorry, may that be, class, the learning deficit is related to, baka yung learning deficit niya is related to motivation, baka the learning deficit is poor language skills, dapat mas pinagtutuunan sila ng pansin. Bakit? Pinagsama-sama po natin silang lahat para it will not be difficult for each one of them to catch up. Now, picture that you have very intelligent students, 98, 98, 98, kumbaga yung grades. Tapos nakasabay dyan si student na 75. Ano po yung mangyayari? Si 98, 98, 98 gets na nila kung ano yung x squared minus y squared. Pero si 75, bakit x? Ano yung x? Saan ang galing ang x? So what would happen, class? She will not be able to catch up. And as a teacher, you might be looking at the entire picture na magaling yung mga students ko, pero may naiiwan pala. Or, halimbawa, this is your class, and then I will give more focus to the one who does not know it. Pag bibigyan ko naman siya, class, ng focus, anong mangyayari sa other three here na matatalino na? They will get demotivated. Anong sasabihin nila? Ay, boring naman ng klase natin. Puro lang x, 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 x. Kahapon pa yung x, 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 x na yan. Di ko na alam. Okay? So mahirap, di ba? Okay? That's why, class, we are grouping them. That's why, class, we have your placement examination because we would want to group the learners based on the results so that we will know that section A needs more of research, needs more of sciences, whereas section Z would need more focus on English, mathematics, and science. Okay? So yan po yung mga isipin natin. Never niyo pong isipin that SSC is more magaling compared to the regular classes. Okay? Mali po yan, mali po yan. Pero technically, pa din nating sabihin na iba yung learning needs ng SSC compared sa regular classes. At iba po yung needs ng regular classes, top sections, compared for those who are lower sections. Okay? That's why iba-iba po yung mode of delivery of education. There are schools na gusto nila naka-separate or naka-per grades. Meron din namang schools na gusto nila scramble lahat. So depende na po yun kung anong model po ang ginagamit nila. So class, one example of this, as mentioned here, is your entrance examination. Okay? Now, the next one type of assessment is your traditional assessment. Okay? Traditional, in other words, pang matanda na, okay, matagal na, nauna pa to sa atin, di pa tayo napanganak, nandiyan na yan. So class, it is use of conventional strategies or tools to provide information about the learning of the students. Okay? Maybe, class, the best example here is identification type of exams. Okay, we refer to that as traditional assessment. Okay, for example, I will ask you, what is the Latin word for assessment? And you will say asidire. So that's traditional assessment. Okay, another form, class, of your traditional assessment is your objective type. So you have your multiple choice. And then, class, you also have your subjective type, which is your essay. Okay, so multiple choice is also a traditional form of assessment. Okay, now, kung nakikita ninyo, bakit natin siya ginagamit pa rin? Because in assessment, again, one of our principle is that we use several strategies to assess our students. Look at us in our class. I have employed already 2 strategies. One is the use of your discussion boards. Okay, and then the other one, class, is that you had your quiz. Okay, so those are examples of using different strategies. So it is said, class, that your multiple choice is objective. Your essay, class, is subjective. Now, when we say subjective, we often encounter a problem with this one. Kasi, class, pag subjective, may tendency tayo. Uy, ang ganda ng introduction, nakaka-touch. Sige, 10 out of 10. Ito, pangit ang handwriting, 3 out of 10. Without you even reading it. Hay, pagkalaw, ay, isang agi. Sige, 3 out of 10. Okay? Now, class, what do we do as educators to address the subjectivity in essay? What do we use nga? for us to ensure that our essay grading will be objective. Okay? What do we use? What should we use? Okay? Yes, how about others? What do we use ba? To ensure class that those requirements would be as objective as possible. So class, tama si classmate, we use your rubrics. Okay, we use your rubrics. You know what, as an educator, I have also observed this, pag maganda yung mood ko class, tapos kakagising ko lang, the tendency ko dati is mataas yung score sa essay. Kasi the sun is still bright and shining, di ba? Kakakape mo lang, kakaalmusal mo lang, so mataas ang score sa essay. Now here comes you, checking at the end of the day, after 5 classes halimbawa, plus parang nakakainis, parang lahat ng answer nakakainis. Tapos alam mo pa yung mga student na maraming etcho sa essay, parang gusto mong sabihan na, uy, direct to the point na, wag nang maraming pang paligoy-ligoy. So class, how to address that, no? Subjectivity is there. Okay? But to decrease it, you use your rubrics. Para kahit pagod ka, kahit pangit yung handwriting niya, nandyan yung rubrics mo. Eh sir, paano kung gusto ko talagang improve ang handwriting ng students ko? Indicate it in the rubrics that you would want their handwriting and that their handwriting is part of their grade. Okay? If yan yung gusto mo. Ewan ko kung anong klase nagpo-focus sa handwriting. Okay? Now, so class, your traditional assessment is the basis for evaluating and grading learners. Diba? Kung nakikita ninyo, you have your requirements. Those are usually traditional assessment. Bakit po siya natin ginagamit? Ease of design and quicker to be scored. Okay? Madali po siyang gawin at saka madali siyang i-score, di ba? Pero mind you, okay? True or false questions are easy to construct. Identification questions are easy to construct. Ano pa yung madali? Enumeration, yun yung pinakamadaling i-construct, di ba? Okay? Kasi enumerate the 10 blah blah blah. Pagkatapos matching type is easy to construct. Among the most difficult to construct is your multiple choice. Okay, among the most difficult to construct is your multiple choice. Why is it becoming difficult to construct class? Because your multiple choice could actually trigger your higher order thinking skills, no? Supposedly, pag tama yung pagkakakonstruct ng multiple choice items. Okay? Kung nakikita nyo class, if my list is accurate, no? This one is increasing on difficulty. And then this one is also increasing in critical thinking. Okay, ibig sabihin class, mas mataas ang critical thinking sa multiple choice compared mo kay enumeration. Okay, enumeration, yes, memorize niya and then after that, so, okay, pero take note as educators, baka sabihin nyo, these are lahat na lang multiple choice. No, hindi naman pwedeng lahat multiple choice. There are concepts that they need to master, they need to memorize, they need to enumerate for them to go forward to the future topics that you have. Okay? And let's look at that. Traditional is referred to as inauthentic type. Kasi po, yung opposite po niyan is tinatawag na authentic assessment. Okay, so plus traditional versus authentic assessment. Okay, now here's the definition of your authentic assessment. The keyword there class is real world context. It allows the learners to perform or create a product that are meaningful to the learners based on real world context. Halimbawa, if I am teaching students in science, no, what would I do? Instead class of just teaching them how to mix acid and base, how to mix water and acid, water and base, I might ask them to demonstrate the experiment using muriatic acid and using lye, which are substances that are used in the household. Para makita nila kung ano yung magiging reaction if ever i-mix sila, which is actually not good. Dapat na i-mix nila, no? So that illustrates learning on the part of the students. Or for example, if I am teaching the students on the different types of solution, or pag sinabi nating colloid, or let's say na lang solution, okay? Let's say for example, we are teaching them about fat solution. Tapos we are teaching them how to separate the solution. Okay, paano ko ipapa-apply? So I will ask them, for example, to bring maybe 250 grams of pork, or konti lang class, huwag yung gawing adobo sa klase. Pagkatapos, I will ask them to boil that in class. And then after that, I will ask them to observe. So di ba class, pag nilaga mo yung baboy, the tendency is that nandyan lahat yung fats. Di ba? Nagmi-mix yung fats. Since I am teaching my students how to separate the different components of a solution, I will tell them, sige, allow it to cool down. Pagkatapos, let's place it on a refrigerator. O, maghanap ka ng refrigerator kasi hindi naman lahat ng schools may ref, di ba? Pagkatapos class, we will observe it back by tomorrow. By tomorrow, makikita nila that the fats are already separated. Pagkatapos below, parang sabaw na lang yung makikita. So, what are you teaching them? That later on, if they want to cook, this is one way for them to cook by separating the fats of the food products. So they are seeing real life context. Okay, real life context, no? So if you're teaching math, for example, rather than teaching the students, okay, the area of a circle is equal to pi r squared, then the circumference of the circle is pi d. Okay? Nga nga yan, class nga nga. So, alam mo nang iniisip ng student, so ma'am, aanhin ko yan. Okay? Magiging nurse ako in the future, anong gagawin ko dyan? Ma'am, magiging architect ako, anong gagawin ko dyan? O pag magiging architect, edi opportunity mo na yan to teach. Okay? So class, you teach them, no? Okay, for example, if we're talking about the wheels of the bus, okay, how will we determine what is the circumference of the wheel? Parang ganon, ha? You connect them to real life lessons because you're talking about authentic assessment. Okay? O, English. Halimbawa, English. O, sasabihin sa'yo ng students mo, ma'am, bakit pa namin yung inaalam yung mga past progressive, mga present progressive? Parang wala naman yung application pag past, present, and future lang. Mas madali po, mas madali lang. Tapos madaling intindihin. So you give them situations. No? Halimbawa, bigyan nyo sila ng situations, usually high school, elementary, kapag mga love na topics, type niya yan. Halimbawa, sabihin mo, itong si Alex, mahal si Ana mula pa nung grade 1 sila. How will you state that in English? Will you say that Alex loved Ana? Hindi, di ba? Kasi mahal niya mula grade 1 hanggang ngayon. So what's the best way of stating it? So you teach them that will be, Alex have been loving Ana since grade 1. Okay? So you try to elicit real life applications. No? Pag wala kasing ganun class, hindi sila makikinig sa klase mo. And then they could not see the purpose. Why do they need to listen to your class? So in college naman, in the college level, for example, if they are engineering students, you ask them to construct machines. You let them construct machines. You allow them to construct even just simple machines as long as the lessons are applied. In your case, since you are to be educators, one way for me to assess whether you know, okay, whether you know our lesson is for me to ask you to create an assessment that could be used for your students. That way I know, at least alam na nila kung paano gumawa ng instructions para sa assessment nila. Alam na nila kung paano gumawa ng multiple choice exams. Those are the real life applications related to your profession. And when we talk about authenticity class, it's best described in terms of the degree of authenticity rather than the presence or absence of authenticity. So in other words, if I'm giving activities, I cannot say that, that activity is purely inauthentic. But I could say that that activity is less authentic compared to these activities. And then kasi hindi naman pwede na lahat mo na lang assessment authentic. Okay? So again, if you would notice, dapat nagbi-build up from the previous topic going towards the next topics that you have. Okay? Sige. Okay, I think that's the end of it. You have any questions so far?